back to session 4 for today. So session 4 is all about species recovery in woodlands and the broader Back from the Brink programme. So in this session, we're going to be exploring how Back from the Brink has supported species recovery in woodlands. First up, we've got Susannah, who's a project manager for the Roots of Rockingham project with Butterfly Conservation, where she's been working on the reintroduction of the Chequered Skipper to Rockingham Forest. So Susannah, please take the stage.
Hi, thanks Ross. So yes, I'm going to be talking about the reintroduction of the Chequered Skipper to Rockingham Forest today. So you've probably already seen this slide this morning, just to show you where we are. We're in the Midlands, the project, and this one here. Our nearest big city is Peterborough. And this is a close-up of the project area. So Peterborough is on this side, and then it stretches down to Kettering. And this is remnants of the old Rockingham hunting forest. And we've been working in about 30 different woodlands across this network. We sort of split them up into 5 different networks. So that was according to how far we think the Chequered Skipper would be able to colonise, which is about 2.5 kilometres. So in each of these 5 networks, all of those woodland blocks are within 2.5 kilometres of each other. But Butterfly Conservation aren't lucky enough to own any land in this area, so we're very reliant on working with our landowner partners, which include Forestry England, Beds, Cams and Northants Wildlife Trust, Boughton Estate and Natural England. So the Chequered Skipper, it was confined in the UK to just to Western Scotland, this area up here around Fort William. But you can see from this map historically that the Rockingham Forest area was one of its strongholds, and that's why we look to reintroduce it back into this landscape. So it was once quite a common sight in the woods of Rockingham Forest. Historical records and diaries show us they used to see hundreds at times in some of the woodlands, which we could only dream of nowadays. But it did decline throughout the 1900s and then quite rapidly after the war, finally being declared extinct in 1976, with the last sightings actually just over the border here in Luffenham Heath. So what happened? So we think it's largely due to the fact that there was a decline in woodland management, there was a cessation of coppicing and an increase in plantations, particularly after the war. And that led to a loss of these lovely sunny, open, sheltered spaces within woodlands that Chequered Skipper relies on. So it's always worth remembering that it's the habitat used by the young stages that's critical in the butterfly life cycle. And so we're looking to create the right habitat for those larval stages. In Scotland, the larvae feed only on a type of grass called purple moorgrass, whereas in England they use different food plants, including false brome and wood smallreed, which are very common throughout the Rockingham Forest woodlands. But in both areas, they like the sort of damp woodlands, glades, including the woodland rides and these lovely way leaves that you see very well used in Scotland underneath the power lines, track sides and woodland edges. So there was a previous reintroduction attempt trial in the 1990s as part of a PhD done by John Moore, but it was very small scale, just into one sort of ride in one woodland, and that actually took place a bit further north from us at the Bardney Limewoods in Lincolnshire. And there wasn't really any commitment to ongoing management of the site, and there were some difficulties with the translocation process, but we've learned a lot from that previous trial and we've taken that forward into this reintroduction attempt. So there's been a lot of work going on behind the scenes in preparation for the reintroduction, long before I even got involved in the project. One of our colleagues in Belgium, Dearne, did some species distribution modelling, and that was taking habitat and climate data, looking at the regions of Belgium where we were looking at taking our source populations from, and then comparing that to Rockingham Forest to see which areas were most similar. We also wanted to make sure we weren't sort of damaging any of the donor population sites, taking too many from them. So surveys took place over in Belgium to make sure we were only taking from healthy populations. And then with bringing something in from abroad, you don't want the risk of bringing in anything unintentional, either parasites or pathogens. So we worked very closely with the Institute of Zoology, who did a disease risk assessment and wrote protocols for us to follow over in Belgium as well as in England. And there was also a vet that accompanied us to Belgium to check the butterflies before we brought them back and before we released them into England. And I spent quite a lot of my first year doing vegetation surveys across a number of the woodlands to see which ones were going to be most suitable for the reintroduction attempt. And we have an annual steering group meeting, which is made up of various stakeholders, the Institute of Zoology, landowners and butterfly conservation, as well as researchers working on the Chequered Skipper. So we went in 2018 to collect our first butterflies. We were collecting adults, and this region here, the Fan for Men region, is the region that had the best fit with the species modelling and the best population sizes. And we don't see great clouds of Chequered Skipper anymore, unfortunately. They do exist across the landscape in quite small numbers. So we were lucky enough to rope in lots of volunteers and researchers into butterflies in Belgium to help with us. And that included two key figures, Dearne and Philip Goffart, who have been sort of key in helping us get this off the ground with their support from the Belgium side. And our aim had been to collect 50 adult butterflies, 40 females and 10 males, mostly females because we wanted them to lay their eggs in the new habitat, and males just to promote sort of natural interactions between the species, and also in case any of the females hadn't mated prior to us collecting them. But we only managed to collect 32 females and 10 males, and we reintroduced them into the new site in England. So after collecting, they were put into cool boxes, and that was to reduce their activity so that they stayed in good condition, as well as not laying any eggs within the pots before we got them back to the reintroduction site. And this is Jenny the vet checking the butterflies in Belgium to make sure they were healthy and had no pathogens or parasites. So we were lucky enough that it was picked up by lots of media who covered the reintroduction. We put them overnight under these nets, and that was so that they could acclimatise to the new habitat, and then lifted them off the next day so that they could fly free into the new site. It was a very cold day though, so they took quite a long time to actually get going, and we had volunteers on site to follow the butterflies so we could look at how they were distributing through the site, as well as see if we could observe any egg-laying behaviour. But the females are very good at disappearing into the undergrowth, so that's quite a hard thing to see. So by the end of 2018, they had dispersed through about 2.8 kilometres of ride, which was looking good, and covered about 49 hectares of the site. And then I don't know if you can cast your minds back to 2018 was a really hot, dry summer. So we were quite concerned that the larvae may not have survived those temperatures and the dryness, but the grass in the reintroduction site was still looking quite healthy. So that was a positive sign. And then it was just a waiting game to see whether any adults emerged in England. And finally, on the 19th of May, I got a phone call from one of my volunteers on site, and that was Dave James, who is the county recorder for Northamptonshire, and he had seen the first checkered skipper, which was this male, and that's a photo of our actual first English sighting of a checkered skipper for about 40 years. And we had volunteers on site doing the same monitoring to see if we could look at the distribution, and again to see if we could observe any egg laying behaviour. And whilst they were busy doing that, we popped over to Belgium again to collect some more adults. We're slightly earlier in the season, so just on that occasion brought back 12 females and 12 males and reintroduced them in the same site to bolster the population. And we marked them with a very fancy red felt pen, and that was so we could distinguish them from the English emerged checkered skippers. And by end of 2019 flight period, this is just the English sighting, well, the sightings of the English emerged ones, and they'd occupied about 4.5 kilometres of ride over 65 hectares. And we were lucky enough that year as well to find some checkered skipper larvae, quite hard in the habitat because there's so much grass to look at, and we hadn't seen any in 2018 when we'd looked, but we did find a few larvae in 2019, which was very encouraging. And then in 2020, the pandemic meant that we had started our surveys a bit late, but we were able to get some volunteers out on site to do surveying across most of the flight period. And by the end of that flight period, we had about 4.5 kilometres of ride occupied over 70 hectares. And then this year we've also been out and about, and looks like they're increasing the amount of area occupied, which is great, spreading out across the site. So just a comparison of the sightings. So you can see this year was really late, which meant we were even more nervous than normal. And we've got similar number of sightings of adults this year to last year, although that's a bit less than what we saw in 2019. And we always see more males than females because the males are territorial and are hanging around waiting for the females, whereas the females just seem very good at keeping themselves inconspicuous. And just a huge thank you to all the survey effort that's gone in over the last 4 years. We've had 47 volunteers involved, and they've put in nearly 180 days of time, which has been an amazing input into the project. So it's not just been about the reintroduction. It's really important that the habitat is right and that the habitat stays suitable for the checkered skipper. So some of the work had gone on prior to the project starting. There'd already been some rides opened up, and the habitat was starting to look a lot better for checkered skipper. But we've also done a lot of work through the project. We've opened up another 7.5 kilometres of ride. And we've also done a lot of ride side vegetation management to get rid of some of the woody vegetation and to open those areas up, and also make them more suitable for the rotational management going forward. And there's also been another 10 hectares of rides that have been put into rotational mowing through countryside stewardship. So just a few pictures of some of the work. So the ride widening, it always looks pretty devastating when it's first done, but it doesn't take too long before it recovers and starts to look really good. And then that's going to be also suitable for follow-on management of the rotational mowing. And sometimes where we can't do ride widening or ride widening is not appropriate, we create some scallops because they create some nice open spaces and nice sheltered sunny spots. And they can either be managed on a rotational basis, or you can cut new scallops in when those ones start to grow over. And we've also been doing this mulching, so that's removing this woody vegetation, which doesn't take long before the rides become dark and overgrown again. But now that again will be suitable to be mown by tractors on a 2-year rotation. Sorry. So what's next? Well, it's really important that we do this follow-on management to maintain those habitats in suitable conditions. So working with the landowners to make sure that that's written into their management plans and can be maintained going forward. We obviously want to continue monitoring the Chequered Skipper, how they're doing over the next year or two. And we're currently looking for further funding. We're not going to just walk away from this after putting all this effort into getting it back into the landscape. Ideally, we would like to get it back into each of those different 5 networks over the next few years and support the management of the sites going into the future. So I'd just like to say thank you to all of the funders that have supported the Back from the Brink project. So that includes National Lottery Heritage Fund and People's Postcode Lottery. Thank you.
Many thanks to hear about a thorough reintroduction program for something that isn't a vertebrate. Really nice. So staying in Rockingham Forest now, we're going to hear from Tim Pankhurst, who's the Regional Conservation Manager for East of England Plantlife. And he's going to be talking about the response of woodland flora to ride restoration in Rockingham Forest.
Hello, my name's Tim Pankhurst. I work for Plantlife, and I'm going to tell you a bit about how we've been monitoring the response of plants to the ride restoration works that have been going on under the Roots of Rockingham project. Intriguingly, although ride restoration is a technique that's well embedded in conservation culture, there's really very little data available about how it affects plant communities, and the Roots of Rockingham project is an excellent opportunity to try and fill this gap. So the principle of the exercise was to record the changes in vegetation resulting from the management works, quantify those changes in structural and floristic diversity, and the changes in frequency and abundance of plants of importance for target invertebrates. It's worth mentioning at this stage that the results are preliminary only, and there'll be more analysis still to be done. So here's the target area. This is an old map of Northamptonshire and the edges of Rutland, and we have a number of woods that we were studying: Castor Hanglands, Old Sulahave Forest, Bedford Purlieus, Westhay Wood, Lady Wood, Titchmarsh Wood, and there's another wood, Southwick Wood, which we've got a priori data for, but don't have any follow-up data as yet. Now, the whole principle of ride management is based on the zone system. My name's Tim Pankhurst. I work for Plantlife, and I'm going to tell you a bit about how we've been monitoring the response of plants to the ride restoration works that have been going on under the Roots of Rockingham project. Intriguingly, although ride restoration is a technique that's well embedded in conservation culture, there's really very little data available about how it affects plant communities, and the Roots of Rockingham project is an excellent opportunity to try and fill this gap. So the principle of the exercise was to record the changes in vegetation resulting from the management works, quantify those changes in structural and floristic diversity, and the changes in frequency and abundance of plants of importance for target invertebrates. It's worth mentioning at this stage that the results are preliminary only, and there'll be more analysis still to be done. So here's the target area. This is an old map of Northamptonshire and the edges of Rutland, and we have a number of woods that we were studying: Castor Hanglands, Old Willow Forest, Bedford Purlieus, West Hay Wood, Ladywood, Titchmarsh Wood, and there's another wood, Southwick Wood, which we've got a priori data for, but don't have any follow-up data as yet. Now, the whole principle of ride management is based on the zone system. In essence, a ride consists of a grassland strip through a woodland with a path in the middle or off to one side where there's wear features, and then to either side of some kind of scrub zone, and behind that the woodland zone. And this is a sort of ideal structure, and really this is what the management is aiming to set up, because it's thought to increase diversity and provide the structures that all manner of wildlife require. So the monitoring is based on this, and here's an example of the monitoring form, and indeed here you can just about see that it's based on a day force system: dominant, abundant, frequent, occasional, rare, and we record plants on that basis in the 4 zones: path, grassland, scrub, woodland. And these are the transects that have been undertaken. A total of 117 transects surveyed, quite a lot of controlled transects, all across the woods. And unfortunately, only 49 of those turned out to be usable because of various areas in planning and difficulties with survey. But in the end, 49 usable transects are used, including several controls there for comparison purposes. And the results show us that the rides are rich. We've got highly variable returns, however. The least rich transect with only 15 species in it, 15 plant species, and the highest is 68. And indeed, the highest species count on a ride of 92 is really very high indeed. And these are the results that are showing up. The one on the right, obscured by me, is in fact all of the woods taken together. And what you're starting to see here is that the data show that there's a very strong response after the initial year. You can see the initial year, if you like, the year 0 before works, is in slightly darker for each of the woodland blocks. And indeed, the response here in the middle one, Ladywood, is very high indeed. So nearly a 100% increase in plant diversity immediately after works. In some cases, there's been a bit of tailing off. However, all of this is great news, because it means that our culture is right. It means our suspicions are confirmed that doing this kind of work does have a measurable and significant benefit for plants as well as other forms of wildlife. But there are some caveats. So the controls here, which are in orange, did in fact show great variability as well. And indeed here on the 4th survey, i.e. the 3rd tranche of surveys after works, we have a recording of a higher species diversity in the controls than in the managed rides. Now that's almost certainly down to changes in survey timing. So most years the surveys were undertaken in the autumn or late summer, whereas in 2021 they were undertaken in the spring. So the data are heavily affected by spring bulbs. And also the staggered management events. Some management was undertaken in the winter of 2018-19, and some the following year, and some the year after that. So the data coming in from those surveys are affected by the annual variation of the vegetation according to climate and weather. It is, however, possible to adjust for these things, and one of the ways to do that is to arrange the data by year rather than by management event, and also to use data only for species recorded in all years, to exclude data that are preferentially recorded in one year or another. And this is the effect. So in this slide, you can see that the control response in the controls is much more even. In other words, they stay more or less unchanged from year to year, but there's a considerable response in the managed rides, in this case green, particularly in the first year, which then declines. Here's another way of looking at it, expressing it as a percentage change over year 1, or year 0 really, in the mean count of shortlisted species. When I mean shortlisted, I mean the species that have been excluded because they are only recorded in a subset of years. And you can see again that the controls are all, there's very little change in the controls, but the first year of response is very high, and then there's a tailing off. And indeed, we put a trend line on that tail, and here it is, an exponential one. And what that would indicate is that the effects of the management, into the beneficial effects for plants, are liable to fade out really over a period of about 5 or 6 years. And that helps us in terms of management planning, because we can advise people that actually applying a rotation in management of 5 or 6 years is liable to lift the plant diversity of their woodlands on a continuous basis. We can also look at the response in the different growth forms of plants. The ones on the right, obscured by me, are trees and shrubs. And very clearly you can see that the graminoids, which is the grasses, sedges and rushes, those kinds of plants, and the herbs show the greatest response and show a year-on-year increase in their diversity. Taking the two together, that's very significant. These are the ones that provide nectar for our invertebrates and provide food plants for larvae, by and large. So it's an important observation. And then we can also look at the percentage increase in species count over year naught again. And this helps us to appreciate the effect on less common taxa, such as the ferns. And here we can see that indeed there's a fern diversity increases quite dramatically in response to works in the 2 years after works, which is a very intriguing observation, because you wouldn't necessarily expect that to be so. We can also look at life cycles. It's probably to be expected that the perennials, which are the greatest, form the majority of the plants, would show the greatest response, but they do of course show gradual increase from year to year. But looking again at the percentage change from year to year, we can see that there's a very, although they are many fewer, there's a much greater percentage change in the number of annuals in the first year, and indeed for biennials in the second year, as one might expect.
Looking at the results of the survey broken up into the different zones across the rise, the most striking observation is that the diversity in the scrub zone, in here green, climbs very rapidly in the first year and then tails off. So this follows the results across the rise as a whole. And it's not surprising, because the scrub zone, i.e. that area at the edge of the open grassland, is the area that receives the management. That's the area that tends to get managed, tends to get cut down, reformed, reshaped, disturbed. And so this is where you would expect most of the diversity. It's also interesting to see, however, that the grassland doesn't respond very quickly at all until the end of the project, when there's a considerable uplift towards the end of the project in the grassland species. And this remains to be investigated. We've also looked at the balance of species of different habitats. It's reasonable to suppose that indeed plants that like paths will tend to occur in the path zone, but not necessarily. Similarly, plants of grasslands may occur in the scrub zone or on the path zone. And they are to some extent notional separations. However, it's quite an interesting analysis to pursue, particularly because if you look here at the red columns, which is the plants of grasslands, they do show a slight uplift through the project, but then quite a significant fall in diversity towards the end of the project, and that's mysterious. We don't understand why that would be. Meanwhile, species of woodland edge, which is again the scrub zone, you would expect to find them mostly in the scrub zone, but you also find them elsewhere. They might be expected to decline because of the severity of the management, but then indeed they do uplift towards the end, which is an intriguing observation. Another aspect which very interested to pursue, we listed a few of the food plants of the invertebrates targeted by the Roots of Rockingham to see how they would respond. There are only a few of them, but what is clear is that many of them do in fact decline as a consequence of the management. And it may well be that in due course they revive, and I would expect them to. I would expect them in the course of time to recover their populations and distribution. But the effects of management appear to significantly reduce their availability, at least in the short term. That's a significant observation for management for invertebrates. However, when we look at their abundance, we find that that generally holds up. So where they occur, their abundance tends to be stable, or indeed in the case of Pontella reptans over on the right hand side, they do increase by a small margin. So quite how we interpret that observation is not yet known. So there we have it. That's a brief review of the data coming in on the ride monitoring. There is a lot of depth in the data. There's still a lot of work to be done to interpret it. But also, from a legacy point of view, this is a piece of work that Plantlife certainly aim to continue well beyond the end of Roots of Rockingham. And of course, we'll be working with all the partners to make the most of that data. But I think that a few years down the road, we're going to have an excellent data set that's going to be useful for woodland managers to improve biodiversity of plants, but also lots of other wildlife as well. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thanks. Now we're going to be moving from the butterflies and plant communities of Rockingham Forest to the Willow Tits of Yorkshire. So now we've got with us Sophie Pinder, who's a project officer at the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and she's going to be talking to us about tracking the willow tit and the importance of connectivity in urban environments for this threatened species. So Sophie, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks. So hi everyone, I'm Sophie. I've been working on the Willow Tit project. So the project is based in the Dearne Valley, which encompasses a fair chunk of South Yorkshire, so most of Barnsley, Doncaster and bits of Rotherham as well, associated with sort of former mining towns, very post-industrial, very urban landscape. And that's where we've been doing a lot of our research for the Willow Tits and pioneering stuff that's not been done before. So that's what I'm going to chat about today. So just a bit of background on the Willow Tit itself. It's a red list species, so of the highest conservation concern. Only the turtle dove is declining faster than the Willow Tit in this country. The decline has been rapid and dramatic. Just to show you on the map there, the dark patches are where Willow Tits have been lost over the last 50 years, so since mid-1970. Pretty much gone from the southeast of England, fragmented in south and southwest, bits of the Midlands and East Anglia and bits of Wales. But the solid pink bits of that map is where willow tit populations are stable-ish over that same period. And you can sort of see the correlation with some former mining communities, bits of Wales, Staffordshire, Lancashire, Yorkshire, Durham, all of those kinds of places. That's where willow tit are kind of clinging on, whereas they've been lost from lots of other places in the UK. We don't know the reason for decline. It's likely a combination of multiple factors, habitat change, potentially climate change. There's a bit of a shift of populations moving northwest, which could explain the extinction in the southeast. But because of the rate of decline, because it's so sharp, it's difficult to kind of pinpoint. It's difficult to monitor populations over a long enough period to really understand what's going on. And that was sort of a precursor to this project and to the sort of research that we were going to be doing. But the stuff we already know is what kind of habitat they use in the lowlands in particular. I won't talk about willow tits in the uplands today because that's not where we've been working. But in the lowlands, they prefer young woodland, so low canopy, dense understory and scrub, a high shrub layer. There's usually an element of wetness, whether that's a stream or a scrape, or even just a high water table. There's usually an element of wetness there, and that correlates to plenty of standing deadwood. So willow tits will excavate their own nest hole every year in rotting deadwoods. More mature woodland, especially if it's dry, is pretty much a certainty unsuitable for willow tits. Mature woodland tends to favour predator species like woodpecker, and competitive species, so blue tit, grey tit, tend to thrive better in more mature woodland. So willow tit have sort of found this niche of early to mid successional vegetation, and that's where we find them in a lot of post-industrial areas that habitat exists. But connectivity is really, really important. So willow tits are generally sedentary. They don't move around too much. They need good connectivity of patches. They won't fly across big open landscapes or anything like that. So biological corridors are really, really important for sustaining long-term populations. And this map kind of illustrates that a little bit. So this is the Dearne Valley Nature Improvement Area, which is where we've been working. This is a map from 2015, so before Back from the Brink started, but we used it as our baseline. Each red dot is a willow tit territory, so usually that will be a breeding pair. And we had 70 of those in 2015 in a 200 square kilometre area. And you can see the trends, like a lot of the dots are on these corridors. So solid blue lines are major rivers, River Dearne, River Dove in this particular area. The dashed blue lines are disused canals, and the dashed grey lines are disused railways. So a lot of the former industrial features are used by breeding willow tit, because following the closure of the industry, high levels of maintenance stopped, and pioneering species, birch, elder, bramble, started to take over and formed this well-connected landscape of willow tit niche habitat. But you can see there's some core areas as well. So Carlton Marsh at the top of the screen and Old Moor in the centre. They are wetland sites with lots of marginal scrub and old railways which run through them. And Woodborough on the left-hand side, that is an extensive willow car habitat. So wet woodland naturally regenerates itself on a 50-year cycle, and they're the places where there's more extensive habitat, so it can support a higher breeding density of willow tit. So because we don't know too much about how willow tits move, how big their territories are, that sort of thing, we don't really know much about their behaviour because they're so secretive. We did a radio tracking study. So that involved BTO licensed ringers putting up mist nets to catch the willow tit, and they were fitted with a colour ring combination to identify the individual. And then if they were heavy enough, they were fitted with a radio transmitter, which emitted a signal, which could be picked up by a receiver, as demonstrated here, which was one of our volunteers. And this meant that we could track individual birds around the landscape. We didn't have to see them, but we could be within meters of them and know that they're there because the signal is being picked up by the receiver. And some birds were tracked for 3 days, some for 10 days. The tracker fell off after about 2 weeks anyway, naturally. And we collected vegetation data associated with where the bird was using, and we collected 2 winters worth of data. So the winters of 2017, 2018, and then in 2018, 2019 as well. So I'm just going to show you some of the results from that and some of the data that the individual birds gave us. So this map here shows a disused canal. Hopefully you can see it running diagonally from the top left down to the bottom right. That's the disused canal in Barnsley. The colours at the bottom, so this is called orange blue, and that relates to the colouring combination on the bird. So orange blue was part of a pair, and their territory was along this stretch of disused canal. And it spent most of its time foraging in the hawthorn bramble scrub along the canal banks. But you can see a sort of cluster sort of in the centre there, and that's actually a conifer plantation. And this bird spent a lot of its time foraging at the top of the conifers, which is unusual for willow tits in the UK. It's more common behaviour in Europe, but it's been noted in Wales as well. But they need this kind of conifer broadleaf mix. They won't use pure conifer plantation. And this bird covered 3.84 hectares, and that was its winter range. So fairly sizable for a small bird. This one was interesting. This is baby blue reds. So this was a first year male, and he covered a similar range of 3.27 hectares, but he jumped around like crazy. He was only tracked for 3 days, and day one he was caught here in this bit of wet scrub, foraged around there for a bit. Day two moved on to the centre of the screen, which is an old colliery or a post-industrial site. Day three moved again, another former colliery site up there, and then he ended the third day down at the golf course, possibly pushed out by another willow tit pair. But he covered, this was like 1 kilometre between each point, which was further than we would usually expect of a sedentary species. So we thought that this guy was unpaired. So he didn't have a mate and he didn't have his own territory. And the willow tits that we tracked that were paired up, they didn't move anywhere near this scale. So if a bird is unpaired, it will go to greater lengths and travel greater distances to find a mate and find its own territory. But you can see the linkage between the patches here. Disused railway there, and again, disused railway there. So these former industrial features are really, really key for juveniles that are dispersing, but also willow tits that are looking to find their own territory as well. And the next map, we're just going to zoom in on the disused railway on the right-hand side. So this is a breeding pair. We've got pale blue and dark blue with a male and female. And this is the disused railway next to Oldmoor wetlands. And they stuck rigidly to this territory here. It was only just over 2 hectares, but they didn't venture out anywhere to forage. They were fairly comfortable, fairly set in where they were. And this one's a bit different. So this is like a solid block of woodland. I think it's the only map we've seen that doesn't have some sort of linear feature. Mixed plantation, semi-natural woodlands, some wet scrub on there as well. So this is red-white. She was female. She was paired up with a male who was also tagged, but he took his tag off within 10 minutes. So we didn't bother with him. We followed her around instead. And she concentrated foraging on the left-hand side. You can see the big cluster there, foraging, but occasionally went out into the more mature bits of woodland and some of the wet scrub as well. And on the left-hand side of that map, you can see a small cluster where the bird actually went into people's gardens and visited the feeders and the hedgerows in the gardens. But they only did that when it was really, really cold and when there was snow blanketing the floor. So supplementary feeding of bird feeders over winter is probably quite positive for willow tits when the invertebrate food source is scarce. And this bird covered 2.92 hectares. So again, on the smaller end of what we've seen so far. But the next map I'm going to show you is a bird which had a territory just north of this map. So they were quite close together. This is red-blue. So this one's a bit different, this map. But the territory where we just were is up here at the north side. And every day, or almost every day, this bird would travel 1.5 kilometers south to this second site to forage, to feed. You can see on the map, those two sites are split. There's some urban, there's a scrapyard there in between the sites. There's lots of open arable fields, but there is a small strip of disused railway which connects the two sites. And whilst the baby bluebird was unpaired, it was travelling around, dotting from site to site looking for a pair. We think this one was probably settled with another bird because there was a routine. Every morning it came down from the north side to feed in the south, and then it went back up again at the end of the day. So it's not darting around trying to find somewhere of its own. It's probably got a territory up at the north side, and then it's just coming down because there's more opportunity to feed at the southern end potentially. And that bird covered a total of 6.98 hectares, which is more than double all of the others. So that was quite an interesting one. And to summarise, really, the importance is obviously the connectivity, but Willow Tit winter ranges vary massively, even in a local area. So it could be solid woodland, it could be linear scrub. They could just use one block of habitat, they could use multiple patches. It's quite varied, and the size varies as well. So the average winter range was 3 hectares, but as you saw in the last map, they could need up to 7. So they need quite sizable areas for their territories and connectivity. So these post-industrial features, old railways, were absolutely crucial. We saw Willow Tits using them in almost all the birds that we tracked to move around the landscape. And they need a mix of vegetation. So it's following that successional trend. They need sort of pioneering species, birch, elder, bramble, hawthorn, those sorts of things. And within woodlands, some of the best management techniques can be creating rides and glades and ensuring you've got that good dense scrub layer, which is sort of grading between the open areas and the woodland areas. They're not exclusively a woodland bird, you know, they're a marginal habitat species, but all of that can be created within woodlands. So that's the Willow Tit and the importance of connectivity. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sophie. A really good talk. I mean, it's a really fascinating one, that is, why there's been such a precipitous decline in that species. Be fascinated to try and find out exactly what's been going on with it. Now we'll sort of wrap up this session with another Q&A. So we've got a few minutes now for questions to the people who've just given talks. So if Susannah and Sophie want to join me on here. Susannah, a first question for you then about the checkered skipper work. Now, I once worked on a few species that have a very similar disjunct distribution, and their decline was often attributed to similar things. So the decline of coppice in once well-managed woodland. But I could never really find any sort of hard evidence of that. It never really stacked up, I think, that explanation to me. And I always thought if it was something else going on too, with maybe, and this is maybe more of a later thing after the Second World War, but when there's been a greater amount of nitrogen deposition in the soil, so you completely change the ground floor communities in these places, in these woodlands. So I know for the species I was working on, I think you probably went through a situation where there was a lot of bare ground and a much shorter sward to much more rank vegetation. I don't know what you thought with regard to the checkered skipper in that respect.
Yeah, I know we do have one of our PhD students, Jamie, is I think starting to look at some of that and see whether there may be any link between farming practices and the decline of the checkered skipper. It might well have had some impact. I wouldn't say in terms of vegetation, the sward, they actually like quite long grasses. So, and I'd say at at the moment our ground vegetation is dominated by grasses. It's there some of the nectar sources that the adults like, the bugle and everything, they do well in the shorter swards a little bit, but the grasses themselves, they don't mind a bit of rank grassland, it seems. So I think it is really a lack of that open space, and the plantations. There was quite a lot of plantations happening in Rockingham Forest, but it probably is a multitude of factors that caused them to disappear.
So historically, it was always that disjunct distribution with the population in sort of central southern England and then a population in Scotland.
Yeah, but the population in Scotland wasn't actually discovered until the 1940s.
Oh,
so
really?
That was, I don't know why I don't know if they looked into why they might not have been discovered before then up there, but yes, so they weren't actually discovered till the 1940s, but seems like it's a relatively stable population up there. But yeah, it was just in these sort of two opposite ends of the country almost populations.
Yeah, really weird. I mean, there's lots of things, rare things that have that same distribution. So you've got a population in, somewhere in southern England, and you've got a population often in the sort of western part of Scotland. It's just so odd those things have come about. I know obviously over time with habitat fragmentation and habitat loss, obviously, bits in between have been lost, populations in between have been lost, but it's just so odd where
there's
a common factor among a few species anyway.
Yeah, it's strange.
And then I think this also relates to your work as well. It's a question from Jane Sears. She's asked, how can we encourage people to better appreciate the value of scrub in conservation? I mean, this is something that I always, I go to the different nature reserves and they've cut away all the scrub, for one species or another. But, it's such a good resource. So many species depend on it that it's, to me, it's a bit of a crazy loss in some places.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one, because if you let the scrub grow up too much, then you can lose valuable habitat. So it is a bit of a balancing act, I think, around maybe having some rotational management. That's what we're working towards. But I appreciate that some of the work that we've done in removing some of the scrub is maybe not so good for some species, but if you don't, you soon end up with completely sort of back to woodland very quickly. So I'd say it's a balancing act, but yes, I agree that people don't always see the value of scrub, like they don't always see the value of long grass. I've been to quite a lot of sites where they just like cutting that edge to edge, and you go and it looks like somebody's garden or something, rather than a nice wild habitat. So
for the sake of tidiness.
It's just teaching people that a bit less cutting is usually beneficial.
Question for you, Sophie. With your work on the willow tit, what's known about the prey of that species then? I mean, has anything been happening with the prey of that, do you think, to cause this huge decline in the population of the willow tit?
With the what, sorry?
Do you reckon any of the prey, do you have any idea what specific prey items it takes?
Yeah, so willow tits will feed mainly on invertebrates that are associated with damp woodland. So things like cranefly, various caterpillars, spiders, all of that sort of thing. So there is an argument that potentially with the climate changing the way it is, we do tend to get longer, drier summer spells, which can dry out bits of woodland and therefore affect the invert population. Obviously, over winter in the cold spells, the prey is less anyway. And the thing about willow tits is that they tend to be bullied quite easily by other species. So with the bird feeder argument, they will use them when they need to. But the thing about feeders is that they attract blue tit, great tit, other species which will outcompete them. So yeah, it's difficult. I mean, climate change is a possibility. Certainly the southeast, where willow tits have disappeared from, tends to be the drier part of the country. So there might be a correlation there, which is why they're moving northwest, where it's a bit better. for now. But yeah, it's a balance. I think there is a place for supplementary feeding over winter, definitely.
Okay. Another question has just come up for you from Phil Grice as well, Sophie. I don't know if you can see it, it's quite a long one. But the start of it just says, based on what we know about the ecology of the willow tit, do you think that the structural changes that have occurred in woodlands in the south and east of England in recent decades, due to lack of management and increased deer browsing, probably trying to get to climate change, have driven the declines in the region? And another bit before you continue. Also, given the species' current association with young successional habitats on brownfield sites, what are the long-term prospects for willow tits in your study area in the absence of targeted habitat management? Sorry, that's quite a long one. Maybe you take that in two parts.
Yeah, so the structural change, there is an argument that deer browsing does contribute to loss of habitat, but at the same time, there have been studies where deer browsing in woodlands hasn't had too much of an impact. I think it's a balance as to the extent of the deer population. If you have an overpopulation of deer, then obviously they're going to browse away the understory with no management, no control. So I think deer are part of a wider range of factors that are contributing to the loss, especially in the southeast. Like I say, the drier summers, there's a lot of agriculture down that way as well, which will clear lots of big areas of scrub and woodland. So I think regards to that, it's a mix of factors, but habitat change, regardless of the cause, is a big one for willow tit loss. The second part of the question, could you just remind me what it was?
Yeah. Also, given the species' current association with young successional habitats on brownfield sites, what are the long-term prospects for willow tits in your study area in the absence of targeted habitat management?
Yeah, not good. Yeah, so I think in the Dearne Valley especially, we've probably got to a point now where a lot of the successional vegetation is sort of becoming too mature, because with the closure of the industry 30 years ago, or whenever, over that 30-year period, it's developed into that niche. But obviously without any kind of management at all, like Susannah says, you're going to develop climax woodland, and you're going to start having the influx of the competitors and the predators, and the loss of the structure that willow tits need. So targeted management is absolutely required for willow tit. One of the things we've been doing, because conservation organisations don't manage everywhere, we've done training with people like Northern Power Grids, who manage underneath the pylons, to leave areas of low scrubby vegetation, and also leave some standing nest posts as well, so leaving stumps at about 1 metre high to try and encourage willow tit. We've done training for the Environment Agency as well, who manage along river corridors, and all of those landowners are going to be critical going forward in terms of maintaining suitable willow tit habitat. And in terms of brownfield sites, we've tried to do a lot of engagement work around the value of scrub and the value of brownfield sites, that they shouldn't just be areas that are put aside for development, and that actually leaving them to regenerate naturally is very, very beneficial for wildlife. Yeah,
true. And another question for you, Sophie, from David Lammercraft, who asked, you mentioned the so what was tempting the willow tit to travel that distance beyond the scrapyard in the example you mentioned?
I'm not entirely sure. There were bird feeders up at that southern site. Whether it was travelling all that way just to get to the bird feeders when there were gardens right next door that also had bird feeders, I don't know, to be perfectly honest. It makes no sense. Really, there's still so much that we don't know about the willow tit. I mean, they're so secretive, and their behaviour is so varied even within their own species that it's quite difficult. I think the main thing to come from that sort of research is that they do need a lot of suitable habitat in order to sustain just the breeding pair. and the connectivity is a vital part of that.
Has anyone looked at the eDNA of the feces of willow tit or not?
Yes, but I don't have a lot of detail on it.
Okay, all right. Susannah, one question for you. So, why was it decided to translocate your checkered skippers from Belgium rather than Scotland? Was there any particular reason for that?
Yeah, several reasons. So population, we didn't want to have a detrimental impact on the Scottish population. There's more populations and more abundance in Belgium. The larval food plants in Scotland are different. So the purple moor grass in Scotland, as opposed to the two different grasses in England, and also the what was the third? The modelling work showed that the climate and habitat was more similar from the Belgian populations than the Scottish populations.
Okay, excellent.